From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
So welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. Today, I'm really thrilled to have somebody who has been on the technical committee for the National Standard of Canada on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace with me. His name is Ian Lewis, and I'm going to get him to introduce himself by really answering the question how a nice occupational therapist like him ended up in the field of psych health and safety. So Ian, welcome. And
well, thanks, Marianne. And when you say there's a nice occupational therapist, I hope you haven't met a not nice one.
Not so far. No, I have not.
Oh, that's great. Well, I've been practicing as an occupational therapist since 2000. And when I take students, it makes me feel old, but I'm not. And I realize that as a mid-career clinician, it's been great to be able to see a lot. And I've been working in the area of work-related rehab since 2004. And my practice is probably about 80% working directly with individuals, 20% working with organizations. And where did I first get involved in psych health and safety? I was thinking about that because you've asked that of numerous other guests. And it's probably back in 2004. I was a really young clinician getting into work-related rehab. And I was asked to come out and do a job site visit for someone who worked in an automotive supply shop. Now, the accident circumstances were really unique. There was a bottle of oxyacetylene that fell off a forklift, exploded, killed a coworker, and left this individual with shrapnel wounds on her groin and her inner thighs and her abdomen. And the question was, what is it going to take to help this person return to work? And wow, okay, so I was pretty green. I'd been in practice for 4 years. Really, it was about how do we go and start to investigate what supports are in this work environment? Talking with the worker to say, well, in order to return back here, what do you think you need? And really starting to dig from that and soliciting from the employer what supports would be available. So this was before our traumatic psychological injuries program had launched in Alberta. This was before the standard. But I remember approaching that situation with such an honor to say, okay, well, you've let me in here to talk about this and hearing from someone who wanted to return to work. And so I think that probably set off my journey of trying to understand what is it about workplace factors that help people to thrive? What helps them to re-enter a place that's scary, that's filled with adversity? And how do we sort of tap into what it is inside of someone that's going to help them get there? And what do we have to do as a workplace to make it happen? And so fast forward through a ton of time spent in rehabilitation. I say to folks, I've been in rehab for 22 years and I haven't got out yet because I love it. I worked for the Workers' Compensation Board in Alberta for a while at their rehab center. I went to work for what was at the time Canada's largest integrated health system in their employee health and wellness department, crafting accommodations, looking at psychosocial job demands. Then I moved to my current practice, which is with CBI Health Group, and working with them to teach others, to also help clients. And really, my role has been to help bridge that gap and to help employers understand, well, here's what's necessary to help this person return to work, working with employees to say, okay, well, you're here and you want to go here. What are some things that will help close the gap? And as an occupational therapist, let's bridge that gap, but then also going to workplaces and saying, hey, you know what, this employee needs to return to work. And here's the gap. Here's the supports that we need to sort of bring around them. Are you game to do that? And so that would be that sort of 80% of my practice, which is very sort of individually focused. The other 20% would be focused around direct teaching of employers, managers, supervisors, how to offer support, how to be aware of support, how to create a psychologically safe environment, and to introduce principles from the standard. And so I think the two areas really dovetail nicely. And when I really became aware of the standard, a friend of mine had introduced me to it, and he said, "Hey, this is coming out. Have you seen it?" And I hadn't at that time, but as I read through it, it's like, wow, this is making sense. This is putting names on so many factors that we spend addressing as a rehabilitation team, that we spend time coaching, and just put it all in one place. And so that's probably where I've been introduced to it. And I have not been able to sort of run away from it. And so I love it so much. I'm working on my master's in workplace health and well-being, and looking at what support employers can offer to their folks. So that's maybe a bit of a long and winding answer, but that's how I got involved in psych health and safety.
Yeah. Ian, it's not very dissimilar to my own story. It's really working with individuals and then thinking, well, what could we do at the organizational stage? But I'm really interested in the one example that you gave us. What did you do to help that woman who had the shrapnel wounds, who had that trauma at work? What did you do to help her return to work? What did she need?
Well, I'd say my involvement was actually quite limited, because I was asked just to come in and do a needs assessment. And so we did lay out a needs assessment of, that there was definitely counseling that needed to happen, and that those structures need to be put in place. But then as a workplace, that there would need to be a period of modified work for them to be open to gradually having her revisit the workplace, to be able to take things at a pace that was appropriate for her. And so I think I outlined needs, but didn't get a chance to sort of see that through as just the limitations of where we are. But I work with folks now every day who are involved in traumatic incidents, and helping them to return to work, to helping them return back to their vocation, which they may have written off. They may have written off and thinking that their symptoms are so severe that they would never, ever get back there.
Yeah. And so what sorts of things do you do to help get beyond that feeling like I just can't do it?
Yeah, a lot of it. And so I don't do this work alone. I work in a team. I work with a psychologist and an exercise therapist, sometimes a physical therapist, sometimes a social worker, counselor. We pull together who we need for what teams, but it's really about sort of tapping into where people see themselves. And I lean quite heavily on a clinical technique called motivational interviewing to really help identify what is it that these folks want and need to feel whole, to feel recovered. And even though it can be really scary for them to say, well, I'd like to be back working as a paramedic on the street, because they may not believe that's possible. It's scary for them to say that. But then when we can really solidify where they want to be, then we can, start to take actions that move towards that. And so really kind of help people understand that, this big disease that you've been labeled with, perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder, perhaps major depressive disorder, adjustment disorder, we can take that label and we can break it down to say, sort of based on where you're at, kind of lend you some hope. We've seen other people really progress through some stages. We want to talk about right now just working on controlling symptoms. Let's work on your depression for a while. And we're going to teach you about how this anxiety thing happens and why going to the grocery store right now and having someone behind you is just like terrible. And we're going to introduce a process to help sort of get back into those various stages of life. And when it's appropriate, we're going to talk with work about how can we sort of dip our toes a little bit into work, and how can we sort of pick and choose what we need from work to help restore confidence in your abilities. And then, one of the tough parts, and sometimes we don't give this all in one piece, right? Because it goes over people's heads. It's a lot of information. But eventually what we're doing is we're bringing people back to the real life circumstances of work, which can be very distressing, and helping their bodies and minds realize that they can be there, they can manage the response, they can engage with the difficult circumstance that happened, they can engage with some of the discouraging thoughts they have. And if going back to work after, say, a knee injury, right, an electrician who has a knee injury, the first couple times up and down the ladder, the first couple weeks perhaps are really, really difficult. And they might second guess it to say, do I have what it takes? Am I going to be able to work off of a Zoom boom? Likewise, someone returning back to a distressing workplace, whether it was they were in a workplace with a bully, they were there and their coworker died of a heart attack, or they were involved in a traumatic incident response. They were working with an angry customer. All of those things can be really difficult. And so we try to give people hope, and we try to break the problem down into smaller steps. And it's like, you know what, we're just going to go through these steps, and we're just going to go through them systematically, slowly. We're going to go through them at a pace that's not going to overwhelm you. And sometimes we might take 2 steps forward and have to take 1 step back. And that's just sort of the nature of it. So it's sort of bringing people along. But if they lack the belief that they can get there, going through all these other stages is really, really hard.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is the most important thing that you do for your clients is give them hope. Give them hope that it can be better. And that's huge. But then the other thing that you've said is you're managing expectations, that this isn't linear. You're not just going to one day be better and it'll all be happily ever after. And then the other thing that you're saying in is really about the idea that the fears and the worries that we have are not about this present moment. They're always about fear or worry about the future or the past. And how do you work with your clients to help them be more grounded in the present in order to reduce the impact of that past traumatic incident?
Oh, wow. There's definitely a few techniques that we use, but mindfulness is a great technique for sort of being aware of the present moment, and then being able to identify that these things that are distressing me are sort of driven by my fear of the future. And maybe I am jumping to conclusions. Maybe I shouldn't think about that right now. Maybe I can acknowledge that thought, put a pin in it, and we'll come back to it when we have some more skills. And so I think helping people put things in perspective and in context of, you're not expected to return to work tomorrow. In the view of a 40-year career, you're halfway through it. And what will things look like 5 years from now? And sort of helping people to take that perspective to say, you know what, we're safe right now. We can work with this here. No one's cutting off your insurance benefits tomorrow. That there's going to be supports. And sometimes people need to see proof, right? So sometimes it's about, can we have a call with your employer, and can we have them express their patience and their gratitude and their waiting for you to come back, So I guess in cognitive behavioral therapy, we're always looking to say, well, what is the evidence? Well, let's look for the evidence that you're going to get better. Let's look for the evidence that people support you and care about you. And likewise, when that evidence isn't there, when their workplace isn't supportive, their workplace maybe hasn't called them, has maybe laid them off, their workplace has given up on them, their workplace has invalidated their injury by trying to say it didn't happen, that makes it the hardest for our folks. And when folks have a tough time finding out that the world supports them, or they find indeed that there's some tangible evidence that the employer is not supporting them, that's really, really hard. And so it's really hard to lend hope, and we have to sort of embrace radical acceptance and work with that totally differently.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said 20% of your work is actually with organizations. So how do you help them to understand? I'm sure in many cases they just get busy. They're trying to deal with what is, and they forget about those people who may be off and may be looking for that support. So how do you help organizations to do better?
So I think what I'd like to say, I've probably been picking the low-lying fruit. So there's organizations that I will work with in the context of their employees off work and return to work. And that's some very deliberate, specific coaching about that situation where they are. And we're not tending to look at an organizational focus. The organizations that I work with an organizational focus are ones that have already bought into the standard. And they are like, you know what? We know that manager and supervisor, line manager, team lead training is what we need, because we need to improve our responsiveness to people, not when they're having an acute mental health crisis, but we need to connect with them earlier when those signs of struggle. Jennifer Dimhoff, I think, coined that phrase, signs of struggle, that when the employee is struggling, we want to provide support. And so I really love it when organizations have already made the decision to say, we're going to invest in pulling the levers that we believe make the biggest difference. And of course, the recent WHO policy brief, the national standard, CAMH's playbook, Deloitte, tons of people recognize that investing on that front end of training leaders is incredibly important. And so it's where I focus most of my efforts. I'd love to say I've been able to lead, large-scale psychosocial risk assessments, and we came up with participatory action plans. No, I'm a humble educator.
Yeah. Now, what do you do? And you know what, Ian, just for your knowledge, I started to do the assessments and the policy work, and I decided it wasn't interesting enough. I like working with people better. So don't think you're missing out on anything. We have to do what gives us the most energy too. Mm-hmm. But you were talking about training managers. What do you do with those managers who maybe have lower levels of emotional intelligence, meaning they're not even aware of their own emotions? They don't deal with their emotions with their family, and to ask them to be more psychologically safe leaders seems too big a leap for them. How do you help them?
Yeah, so the curriculum I use, we start out by talking about the mental health continuum, which is published by our Department of National Defense, talking about being in the green, the yellow, the orange, and the red. We talk about like an everyday occurrence. We talk about, can someone with diabetes live in the green? Can someone with diabetes be in the red and be incredibly ill and near death? Well, yeah. And people get that. And then we talk about it on an emotional functioning end and kind of walking through that, and then asking people to say, well, if you reflect on this, where would you say you are in the last week? Where were you 6 months ago? And then we kind of transition into another exercise of looking at the challenge and performance curve, and talking about when challenges are higher, performance is high, but when we start to get overwhelmed and we start to get sort of on edge, we're second guessing ourselves, and talking about sort of that slide into burnout and loss of function, and asking people to identify where they've been at various times, and really hoping to kind of get people in touch and to sort of pinpoint yourself where you are, because out of our self-awareness allows us to really relate to the person in front of us and to acknowledge our own internal state, but then we have to be able to acknowledge theirs. And the second part of the course is that we talk about how to use reflective listening to have someone expose where they are, so we don't put our own assumptions. So if we're feeling stressed and hurried, that might not be where they are. They may feel lethargic, slowed down, held up, and they're second guessing themselves. And that holding space and waiting for people to contribute to that space is where the leadership comes from. And so a lot of people say, well, I always feel like I've got to have my manager hat on, and I've got to lead the conversation. I've got to tell them that it's time to buck up and that we need results. And it's like, and they learn that in the seminar. And so I don't think I can take someone who has no sense of emotional intelligence and take them from here over to here. But if they move that needle just a little bit, and you see it, like you see big differences in organizations. There's certain, professions that are stereotyped to not have feelings. And hey, some of it shows up in spades. But I've also taught in organizations in the tech industry where we have incredibly emotionally aware leaders. And so I think it's just trying to bring them along a little bit further in the employee experience. And I know it's really old, but the Working Through It videos from Great West Life Strategies for Mental Health, now is Workplace Strategies for Mental Health, firsthand lived experience, right? Like that's, people get a sense of, well, this is what my employees might be going through. So I think that's probably my hook into trying to improve emotional awareness. And it starts with self-awareness.
You know, Ian, I say that for me, it feels like I've been in therapy for 15 years because of the work I do, and the experience with working through it and those amazing people has been life-changing for me. But one of the most impactful situations was talking to Matthew Dixon, who at 22 had just completed his engineering degree and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he said it was a nightmare. Like he said, it was like living in a nightmare. But he kept doing all the things they said to do. And he said at a very, very slow pace, he got a tiny bit better. So over 20 years, he ended up, he's very high functioning, making a difference, contributing. And when you speak to individuals who've been through that, you think, what is the human mind capable of? If somebody with schizophrenia can manage his thoughts, then why can't we? And I think we have so much untapped potential. And so what you're doing, giving hope and managing expectations and helping leaders, all of that it can contribute to it. Do you have any examples of where somebody who had been traumatized or was dealing with serious mental illness inspired you?
Yeah, I think there's many inspiring stories. So many of our folks have been through something incredibly difficult. People talk about losing a child as something that you never get over. So I've walked with parents who have lost children in traumatic ways. I think of a dad whose son unfortunately died by suicide in their home, and how to be courageous and to face feelings, to have fundraisers in the name of your child. Those sorts of things, I'm really, really inspired, because I think if that was me in that situation, I don't know if I could walk through the grief that way. Our natural reaction as humans quite often is, when we're under threat, is to hide and to hoard the resources that we have. But instead, to open ourselves up, to accept help, to talk, to take action. That's incredibly inspiring for me. And I wouldn't want to give too many details, just respecting confidentiality. But when I've seen parents be able to host fundraisers in honor of their children, that's amazing to me. And I know it's not like that for everyone, but I find that just amazing. And so that's probably one example. But the other is that when people are involved in really traumatic or potentially traumatic events, like corrections officers, paramedics, first responders of all sorts, public safety personnel, and they go back to it because they are driven by what got them into it in the first place. And I find that amazing, because while most of us would say, I've had enough of that, I'm just going to go choose a different career, these folks are like, no, this is important enough to me that I want to do it. So it's not a pension or something else that's holding them in there. Is that internal drive. And so I think that's what's so important, to be able to talk with people about what do they really want, because what they want, helping them function in such a way that they can live well. And so, like the WHO definition of mental health is being able to participate in the communities of choice that we have, to be able to engage in the occupations that we want. And so it's not just the absence of symptoms, it's being able to engage with life and participate. So Yeah, that's a long way of telling you about what inspires me, but I learn so much from my clients. And one of the powerful questions in therapy is to say, well, when there's been difficult times before, what did you do? And I hear people telling me about how they quit drinking, how they coped with the loss of someone, and then they're kind of like, hey, you know what, this situation, yeah, we can do this. Those were tough. This is tough too, but we'll get through this.
Yeah.
And they present the rationale for hope.
Hmm. So what you're describing is post-traumatic growth, right? Where we take a difficult situation, if not traumatic situation, and we learn and grow from it so that we can give back and move forward. And yeah, it is inspiring to see and to be part of. Now, Ian, in the beginning, you were talking about the original situation that you described, where it was a physical safety risk. And when the standard was developed back in 2013, we did not have a psychosocial factor called protection of physical safety. But because those in the health and safety field saw the connection between an explosion that physically injured you at work and the impact on your psychological safety, they added it. And so it is now the 13th of the named psychosocial factors. Of course, there's the 14th one that people forget about, which is other chronic stressors identified by employees. But in your estimation, how important is organizations' approach to physical safety in terms of the ability for people to recover and want to go back?
It's huge. For all of us, none of us want to return back to a really difficult situation. So, for example, if you were heading out for coffee and you had an incredibly long lineup at this one location, you're like, I'm not going back there, right? We don't want to go back to unpleasant situations. That's just human nature. So, let alone things that threaten us. So, we would never want to go back into a workplace with a bully. We would never want to go back to a workplace where there's a high likelihood that we could become injured and get back in this state of pain and disability and miss out on birthdays and snowmobiling and all of our hobbies. So why would we want to go back there? And so when an employer appears to have a very callous attitude towards any element of health and safety, be it psychosocial factors or physical factors, it's just a huge unmotivator, right? They're like, hey, I want to recover, but I don't want to go work there. As soon as I'm back to work, I'm jetting. I'm going to someplace that really cares about their staff. And so it's not just the traumatic events. It's even the things like I'll hear from nurses saying, yeah, I don't like to lift or transfer with so-and-so. They're just not very good at it. They're going to hurt me. And so we all have this innate desire to protect ourselves, conserve resources. And so if the employer is not going to do anything about it, it's really hard. So what I feel really bad for is our captive workers who they're working there out of necessity. They don't have a lot of choice or skill discretion in how they do the jobs. So they have high demands, low control, and perhaps they're low skilled. They're being held in that job maybe by a pension. It's got good benefits, but their body's wearing out. And whether the employer has their safety in mind or not, they're doing hazardous work. And a lot of us think hazardous work is explosives or things like that, but it can be everything from you're delivering window units to rural hardware stores, and no one helps you unload, and you take 300-pound window units down a ramp in snowy conditions. Wow, those people worry about that. Mm-hmm. They worry about, am I going to fall? Am I going to fall and slip and be permanently injured like that other guy at work, right? So physical safety is huge. And for folks who, like me and you who work in offices, we think, well, yeah, it's relatively safe. Nothing's going to fall on my head today. But for many people still in this economy, they're using their backs to work, and that's their meal ticket. They become injured, and their physical prowess, their ability to generate an income, carry on a livelihood, is really at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, when we talk now about the Great Resignation, and I know some of it is just people had time to reflect and decide what mattered to them in life. But what you're describing in terms of physical safety is also a reason why people are leaving if they can find something that is safer. Have you heard of other reasons why people are leaving jobs right now?
I think for a lot of people, well, for a lot of us, COVID-19 and the pandemic exposed some vulnerabilities. So when someone becomes, when they're away from work for whatever reason, they might start to look back and say, oh, I'm reevaluating this. So maybe it's not physical safety as the reason why I'm not going back here to this workplace, but it really kind of affirmed to me that, yeah, I don't matter or I don't fit here. When I needed support, no one included me in the office Christmas party when I was off work. No one kept me up to date on who was retiring and what was going on. No one phoned to check on me to see how I was doing. And I hear that equally in both cases of physical injury, but also when people are off work for psychological reasons. And so when they return there, they're kind of like, if I can choose where I put my discretionary effort, it's going to be elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to make a difference in the way I think a lot of employers treat employees, because I remember probably 15 years ago them saying, oh, with all the boomers getting older, you're going to have to pay attention. But of course, then the retirement age changed. The boomers stayed. And so there was still so many possibilities in terms of employees. But now we are at a place where I think we're going to have to be more discerning about how we treat people. And I said to somebody, Ian, that I almost think I manifested the pandemic, because I said, I really wish employers would understand why their employees' mental health is so important. And now many of them do. But it took having a whole population exposed to stress and uncertainty.
I have to wonder, though, if maybe a little bit of it was that leaders and managers themselves were so under strain and the environment was changing so quickly, it was imperative that they paid attention to mental health. Number one, they were experiencing it themselves, which caused them then to reach out and to consider. But I was reading something the other day and talking about that maybe we're going back to business as usual. And for some employers, going back to that, employees are a commodity. We can hire more. We don't have to do this. But yet, hopefully, somewhere in the competitiveness, there's a Deloitte report I read a couple of weeks ago that talked about that maybe we should be including occupational health and various metrics of psychosocial health and safety in our ESG reporting.
Yeah, really, because I think, especially for the younger generations who are so much smarter than I was at their age, they're looking for this and they're saying it's not negotiable. I'm not going to work in a toxic workplace. I want work-life balance. And so that kind of reporting, I think, will be really good for employers who want to attract and retain talent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, Ian, I want to get you to tell what you wish for the evolution of the national standard on psychological health and safety. You're part of the committee. Where do you hope that it goes?
Oh, where do I hope that it goes? I had this utopian dream that somehow the standard could be so relatable and so easy for people to get the gist of it, to say that, yeah, we can get on this road to health and safety at whatever degree that we're sort of ready for it. Because I think people engage in some all or nothing thinking, hey, we got to do everything here. But what is a way that we could inspire participation in the standard? So not compliance. Now, regulation is another thing. I think regulation is really important. But how can we get employers saying, I think this is doable. I think that I can implement this. I think we can bring people alongside. I can bring my colleagues at the leadership table on board with this, because like the occupational health and safety regulations in our provincial jurisdictions and the Canada Labor Code, yeah, they are like you must. And I agree with the standard in saying that we need language that aligns with regulation. You must, because there is definitely a minimum standard and a floor. But how do we make it accessible? Because the occupational health and safety regs in the provinces and Canada Labor Code, we have, not a great historian here, but I'm going to guess 80 years of health and safety to fall back on. We have language. Everyone knows about falls arrest systems. They know that we need to label things, that there is barriers required at certain places, that we assess risk, that we do field level hazard assessments before we start welding or doing some activity that could potentially be harmful. We engage everyone who knows about the potential safety risks in contributing to a field level hazard assessment. And so how could we make psychological health and safety so accessible that people don't write it off as that's just too much? I don't understand that. So that would be sort of my dream for the standard. And I don't know how we get there.
No, well, I'm with you on it. And that's what I've said at the different meetings, is that let's not make it more difficult or complicated. Let's make it as easy as possible. But I even say to employers, even being involved with the standard, you can start to change psych health and safety today by just asking, how will this policy, this plan, this decision, this event impact the psychological health and safety of our employees? It's so simple. And yet it could revolutionize a workplace immediately.
I agree with you 100%. And the follow-up question to that would be, and I guess maybe when you've asked employers and you said something like, so when you've gone to your occupational health and safety committee, or when you've gone to your workers, what do they tell you? Because I'm curious to know if that is a roadblock where employers don't feel like they can engage their workforce on an informal level and open themselves up to, hey guys, what can we do? How is this decision going to affect you on the shop floor? How is this change? How is it going to affect your ability to do operations? Or how's this going to affect your home life? Like, will an employer take that step?
Well, if they have a good relationship with their employees, that would be a normal course of conversation, right? This is what we're thinking. We want to get your feedback. Not that, what did somebody say to me once? The tail's wagging the dog. It's not that employers are giving up all of their rights and their authority. It's simply that the employees have a different perspective that is so valuable, because if they're the ones doing the work and they can tell you what gets in the way of them doing a great job, they can help your organization be more successful. But if my opinion is that all employees have bad attitudes and they don't care, and I just got to wring out every ounce of work out of them before I let them go, then that conversation feels like opening up a can of worms. But yeah, it just depends where you're at, right?
Well, and I think so, right? So if an organization has the maturity of those feedback loops, that they're able to say, oh yeah, right, well, we've done that before. We asked them about the color of paint in the locker room, right? It's a natural step for them to be able to implement something like that. But it's almost like maybe to help make the standard accessible and to have joint participation, that we need to have some sort of mechanisms to help people that currently don't consult and don't have involvement and influence in their organization, to say, how do we begin that? How do we move from, this to this?
To be able to open it up. When we developed the On the Agenda series, that's what we looked at, is if you're afraid of having the conversation and you want to be able to make sure that the employees aren't asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars, and you can't deliver, then that's what that was for. Leaders that have that natural ability to interact don't need all the supports. But for those that are anxious about it, that don't feel confident, then resources exist for that. How would you help an organization go from very low trust to something where they could have those conversations?
Mm. I think one organization, I worked with a private paramedic organization who explicitly said, we have a trust problem. And we know that within paramedicine, first responding organizations, that the system itself might be more psychologically harmful than exposure to trauma. The work of Nick Carlton and CIPSERT has sort of demonstrated some of that. This organization had 3 member suicides, and that drove the owner of the company to action. And he said to his employees, I take this really seriously. I'd like us to begin to do mental health training. And so that was a really strong direction from a leader who said, I'm going to make a change. He didn't have to stand up and say, you know what, guys, the problems we've had around shift scheduling and overtime and 24-hour call, he didn't come out and say, hey, I'm wrong about all that. But he just said, you know what, I think we need to double down on this. Right. So he presented the need and kind of indicated an action plan. So I think leader intention followed by action. That's why I love the language of the psychosocial safety climate, talking about policies, procedures, and practices that are enacted in the workplace that start to develop that trust. And so, even as something as simple as coming and asking an employee group for feedback and then do what you're going to say you do. Even how small it is, that relationship trust capital has to develop. Yeah. So I'd probably start by asking a leader to say, like, how would you characterize the trust relationship?
Mm-hmm.
And why?
Yeah, that's great. In terms of the standard, if you're looking at it, you can't actually enact it without meaningful participation and two-way dialogue. But some people do. They say, oh, we've done the standard, but what they mean is we've checked off all the boxes of, the paperwork and the policies and the procedures, but behaviors haven't changed. They haven't actually taken on the intention or the spirit of a psychologically safe workplace. And so I think we need to make it simpler and make it more effective at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so if there were those organizational levers that we pull that say, you know what, not that the factors aren't all important, but you know what, the idea of how we do it is super important, and that the joint participatory, bringing people along, their hearts and minds, your smart people will help figure out what you need to address. And so there might be maybe some emphasis that we need to put on process and joint participation. And I think the literature would probably bear that out from a research perspective. And organizations that go far go there together. They have teamwork, they have collaboration, and that's probably proven on a ton of different business outcomes. And maybe we had the change management folks at the table a little bit more, talking about how organizations create effective change. Maybe that's something that needs to be added into the standard.
That's a great point. A really great point. Yeah. All right. I'll put you in charge of looking after that, Ian. I think having the very best, because change management has changed a lot. Mm-hmm. That what was considered best practice years ago has significantly shifted. And whether they were wrong before or whether they just know better now, I'm not sure, but I think it would be a fantastic add-in that if we use best practices for change management, that would be great. Yeah. Now, I know we're getting close to time and there's still so much, but I want to ask you this question. If you had somebody who had no concept of psychological health and safety and you wanted to describe for them what it feels like to be in a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, how would you describe that?
Oh, I've been thinking about that because I know you ask everyone about that. And instead of trying to be comprehensive, I think what you need is your guests to describe their viewpoint on that. And so I think a psychologically safe workplace, from my perspective, is one where every team member feels like the organization has their back And that even if they were under duress, if they felt like they were slipping under the water, that they could ask for help, that they didn't have to shrink back. And you brought it up a few minutes ago. Those conditions are created by trust. And trust is developed through repeated experience, that we see that our leaders walk slowly through the halls, that they are accessible, that they respond in psychologically safe ways. And so a psychologically safe work environment is one where everyone would feel like they could ask for support. But the corollary of that is it's a two-sided thing, in that often when people are struggling, when they're in the orange and the red on the mental health continuum, they don't reach out. So we know the stats are is that people don't disclose to their manager. They don't necessarily reach out for help. And that's a characteristic of many mental health problems. And so the other part of a psychologically safe work environment is a leadership group that is attentive. And so I think attentive towards, do people feel like they belong? Can I stop and ask them how they're doing? Do I notice when something is different? Do I monitor workload? Do I monitor potential stressors, roadblocks, things that get in their way? And do I come to their aid? So it's not just a, hey, call me if there's a problem. It's a, I notice there's a problem. And is there anything I can do to help? As your leader here in my role in our organization, is there anything I can do to support you? And maybe there's nothing that leader can do. But when they say, is there anything I can do to help you? That speaks volumes. And I think of, many people have seen the Brené Brown video on empathy. That connection, I'm seen, I'm heard, it goes a long way. So a psychologically safe work environment is where we would feel comfortable disclosing, but we know that we're not likely to disclose unless that person comes to us and says, are you okay? I see things are different. Is there anything that we can do? And so, all the factors we mentioned in the standard, clear leadership and expectations is one of those things, right? Where it's like, I express as a leader that I've got your back. I want to be attentive to the things that are impacting you and your workload here at work. And when I see you struggling, I want to be able to come and talk to you about that. And so setting that stage, I think, creates a real environment of psychological safety. So I don't know if that answers the question, if that makes it succinct enough for anyone to take that home, but that's really what I feel.
It's an amazing answer, Ian. But you know what I really got hung up on because of the visual is leaders walking slowly through the halls and understanding how they're busy, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed. But when they're around the employees, can they slow it down enough to say, I see you, I'm here, I'm accessible? And that visual is stuck in my head now because that stressed out, overwhelmed, really fast moving leader is the usual image.
Well, I think maybe it resonates a lot with me because I think I was there. I think I was a leader who was, very much head down, and I'll demonstrate my commitment by working hard with you. But sometimes I think that meant that my nose was to the grindstone a little too hard to look up and look around and see who needed me and who needed me to do what. And so, in our digital workplace, right, like that envision of walking slowly through the halls, walking through the shop is really different for a remote workforce, right? But I've talked with remote teams, and great leaders create reason to connect. They find ways to walk slowly through the halls digitally. Dispatchers checking in with truck drivers or bus drivers on the road. Nurse managers who manage nurses who they actually never get to see their whole workforce in one place ever. Finding ways to check in with people. And so the creativity of leaders who look and say, my role as a leader is to be a people leader, not And I like how I think it was Jordan Friesen who put it on the podcast. It says, we're human beings, not human doers. So people respond. We need to be human to them. We need to ask for their response. We need to consider each of them. So when people leaders say, my job is to lead people, human beings, I'm going to work with them as such. And that means that I walk slowly through the halls. I seek relationship. I seek relationship before I seek output. Some of those things are probably pretty important. And I don't have a scientific study to go back and prove that, but it's my gut.
But you know what the irony is, Ian, is that the leaders who slow down enough to do that are also taking care of their own mental health, because they're on the path to burnout or gastrointestinal problems or some other kind of health issues by being on and anxious and, pressured all the time. And if they slow down only because they want to be a better leader, it's still going to help them personally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why I think going back, in our talk to say, like, how do you help people who aren't very emotionally aware to become more emotionally aware, is we often use ourselves as reference. So not that my story is the same as the person I'm working with, but if I understand my story a little bit and how psychosocial stressors affect me and my responses, allows me to hold space and ask them, so how does this stressful event or how does this workplace thing really affect you? If you dug into it, like, are you happy just to keep continuing that for like forever? And when we start to put things in real functional relational terms like that, people are like, oh, let me think about that. Not asking someone to say, have you had symptoms of a mental health problem? No, this last change we did in the workplace, how do you think we did on that? Was that a 9 out of 10 or was that like a 1 out of 10? Right. And putting it in real relational terms, demystifying that stuff, because that connection, then people will begin to contribute.
Yeah. Well, and also you're making it safe when you say, yeah, I used to be that leader who was always nose to the grindstone, but I didn't notice what was happening. You make it safe for other people to go, ooh, yeah, I think I'm doing that too. As opposed to Ian Lewis, who's always been this amazing, intuitively great leader and trying to teach me how to do it too. It's a much better way to teach people.
Yeah, we all got our warts. We got our skeletons in our closet, and we got to just expose those and be human and vulnerability, right? So folks expect their leaders to have an appropriate level of disclosure and vulnerability, because let's face it, we're all human. It sounds so clichéic, but we've all learned something along the way, and so let's help each other get a leg up by what we've learned.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Ian, for all of this. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm sure I could talk to you for another hour, but maybe I'll get you to come back sometime and we can chat some more. For people listening, if you subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast, you get to hear people like Ian share, just to me, nuggets of wisdom that can make all our lives, including our working lives, easier. So thanks a lot for joining me today, Ian.
Thanks so much for having me. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants compared to some of the other people you've had on. So really honored. Thanks so much.
Well, and I'm sure they're really honored to hear you say that too. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.